He was richer than Rockefeller, wealthier than any king, emperor, or pharaoh who had ever lived. At his peak, his fortune was nearly 2% of the entire American economy. Adjusted for today's figures, his net worth would exceed $400 billion, surpassing Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bernard Arnault combined. His name was Jakob Fugger, and for a brief moment in the 16th century, he was the undisputed master of global finance. He bankrolled emperors, he financed wars, he controlled the copper and silver markets that served as the backbone of European commerce. Popes sought his counsel, kings begged for his loans. The Fugger family banking house stretched across a continent, its influence reaching from the mines of Hungary to the Vatican treasury in Rome. And then, it all disappeared. Not overnight. Not in a single dramatic crash, but steadily, inexorably, across generations. The family that once dictated terms to monarchs faded into historical footnotes. The fortune that seemed invincible crumbled under the weight of forces its architects never anticipated. Today, few people outside academic circles have even heard the name Fugger. The greatest concentration of private wealth in human history evaporated so completely that most assume it never existed. This is not a story about bad luck. It's the anatomy of how the mightiest fortunes collapse. How the very strategies that build empires contain the seeds of their destruction. And how the rich, no matter how powerful, remain subject to forces larger than themselves. The Fugger story begins in 14th century Augsburg, Germany. Hans Fugger arrived as a weaver, skilled and disciplined, saving his earnings and slowly expanding his operations. He left his sons a respectable business, but they were destined for something unprecedented. Jakob Fugger, known as Jakob the Rich, was the architect of this transformation. Born in 1459, he was initially destined for the church. But when his elder brothers died unexpectedly, Jakob was pulled from his religious training and thrust into the family business. He proved to be a prodigy. While his competitors thought in terms of local markets, Jakob thought in terms of systems. He saw connections others missed. He understood that real wealth came not from selling goods, but from controlling the infrastructure through which goods and money flowed. His first great insight was vertical integration. Instead of just trading copper, the Fuggers acquired the mines themselves. They controlled extraction, processing, and distribution. His second insight was even more consequential. Jakob understood that the greatest borrowers in Europe were monarchs. Kings needed money constantly, and their expenses always exceeded their revenues. The treasuries of Europe ran on credit, and whoever controlled that credit controlled the crowns themselves. Jakob Fugger became the primary creditor to the Habsburg dynasty, the most powerful royal house in Europe. When Charles V sought to become Holy Roman Emperor, Fugger supplied the bribes that secured the election. The price of an empire paid in Fugger gold. In return, the Fuggers received mining rights, trade monopolies, and a steady stream of interest payments that made them ever richer. At its zenith, the Fugger banking house operated branches across Europe. Their network of correspondents provided intelligence that rivaled any spy service. They knew which kings were solvent and which were desperate. The Fugger newsletters, internal reports on political and economic developments, were the Bloomberg terminals of their age. Jakob himself became the first modern capitalist. He reinvested profits relentlessly. He pioneered double-entry bookkeeping. When critics accused him of usury, he dismissed them. When the church questioned his methods, he pointed to the charitable works his wealth funded, including the Foggeret, a social housing complex for Augsburg's poor that still operates today, the oldest of its kind in the world. But within this triumph lay the foundations of catastrophe. The Fugger fortune depended on two assumptions that seemed unshakable, but were not. First, that monarchs would repay their debts. And second, that the economic system enabling their dominance would persist indefinitely. Both were wrong. The relationship between the Fuggers and the Habsburgs was symbiotic but deceptive. When a merchant lends to a king, who truly holds the advantage, the merchant can demand repayment. The king can refuse. In the short term, creditors seem powerful. In the long term, sovereigns hold the ultimate cards. Jakob Fugger died in 1525, leaving the richest fortune in European history to his nephew Anton, but Anton inherited not just assets, but also vast sums owed by monarchs who had no intention of prompt repayment. King Philip II of Spain defaulted on his debts 4 times. 4 times he simply announced that Spain would not pay what it owed. The Fuggers were devastated by each default. They had lent in good faith, But those promises meant nothing when the king decided they meant nothing. This is the first great lesson of the Fugger collapse. Lending to the powerful is profitable until it is catastrophic. The returns are attractive precisely because the risks are real. The Fuggers couldn't simply stop lending. Their entire business model depended on Habsburg favor. Walking away from the Habsburgs meant walking away from the foundations of their wealth. They were trapped. The second force destroying the Fugger Empire was structural change. In the 16th century, the center of commerce shifted from southern Germany to the Netherlands and England. New competitors emerged, hungrier and more attuned to the changing conditions. The Genoese bankers who replaced the Fuggers as primary creditors to Spain operated through complex financial instruments that spread risk. The Fuggers remained a family firm, their fortunes tied to their own capital. When losses struck, there was no one else to absorb them. The third force was inflation. Spanish conquests in the Americas unleashed floods of silver that dwarfed European production. This massive influx of silver triggered what economists call the price revolution. Too much money chasing the same goods caused prices to rise steadily for over a century. The Fuggers held enormous claims denominated in currencies that bought less with each passing year. At the same time, their own mining operations faced competition from cheaper American silver. The very foundation of their wealth was being undercut. The fourth force was internal. The hunger and discipline that create wealth often fade in those who inherit it. Jakob Fugger had worked relentlessly. His successors lived differently. They purchased titles and estates. They married into noble families. They drifted from being merchants to being aristocrats. The counting house that once commanded their ancestors' total devotion became one interest among many. They became rich people rather than moneymakers. The distinction proved fatal. By the early 17th century, the Fugger banking house was a shadow of its former self. The final collapse came during the 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe. The physical infrastructure of Fugger operations was destroyed along with the broader economy. By the time peace returned, the family had retreated entirely from banking. They survived as minor nobility, their commercial legacy a distant memory. What lessons does this forgotten collapse offer? First, concentration kills. The Fuggers placed enormous bets on a single counterparty. Modern investors who concentrate holdings in a single company or sector face identical risks. Second, lending to the powerful is dangerous precisely because it seems safe. A debtor powerful enough to borrow unlimited sums is also powerful enough to refuse repayment. Third, structural change destroys incumbents who fail to adapt. Industries transform. Technologies become obsolete. Adaptation is not optional. It is survival. Fourth, generational wealth requires generational discipline. The hunger that builds fortunes rarely survives inheritance. Without structures that preserve both capital and the culture that created it, dissipation is nearly inevitable. And finally, no fortune is permanent. The richest individuals in every era believe their wealth is different, more secure, built on foundations that cannot crack. The Fuggers controlled resources that seemed irreplaceable. They held claims backed by the most powerful monarchs on earth. None of it mattered when the underlying conditions changed. 4 centuries later, their story survives as a warning. Wealth is temporary. Power is borrowed. The forces that build empires eventually reclaim them. Jakob Fugger calculated everything except the one variable that defeats all calculations, time. And time collects every debt, especially the ones marked eternal. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling tales. See you next time.